Welcome to Betrayal Narrative X.
Henry was sitting on the edge of the bed and mechanically tying his tie when Grace suddenly threw a phrase that stuck in his head like a splinter. "If you were more obedient, life would be easier for both of us." She said it casually, without emotion, adjusting her earrings at the mirror. Just a fact not to be discussed. As if he weren't her husband, not a bright student who should finally learn the rules. Henry didn't answer. He was used to not answering. During 5 years of marriage, he had learned to let such remarks pass his ears to avoid arguments. But now something had gone wrong. The phrase hadn't dissolved into the morning rush, or been erased by the sound of the coffee machine, or disappeared when he got behind the wheel. Not smarter or considerate or kinder, but more obedient. That thought wouldn't leave him alone all day. At work, he did his tasks automatically, but his consciousness was somewhere far away. Everything suddenly began to fit into one picture. All her phrases, her tone, her confidence that she knew what was best. That evening, when they were eating dinner, Henry spoke first. "What did you mean this morning?" Grace lifted her head from her plate, blinked in surprise. When she told me I needed to be more obedient." She grinned, shook her head, and went back to eating. "Are you serious?" "Henry, you get caught up in little things sometimes." "It's not a small thing to me." Grace set her fork aside and sighed like a person forced to explain the obvious. "It just means that if you argued less, things would be easier. But why should I obey? Not to obey, but to trust. If I say something, it's usually the right thing to do. Have I ever let you down?" Henry didn't immediately find something to say. He looked at his wife and suddenly realized that he couldn't remember the last time he had made his own decision. "And if I don't agree, then we waste a lot of time explaining, and end up doing as I suggested anyway." Grace shrugged. "So what's the point?" She smiled, as if she'd made a logical point in the argument. Then she reached over to his plate, took a piece of fish from his fork, and put it in her mouth without asking. When they first started dating, Henry had admired her confidence. Grace always knew what she wanted. Her willpower seemed to him a sign of maturity, her confidence a trait of a person who gets what she wants. But now he looked at her and felt small. For the first few months of their relationship, she said she wanted to help him become a better person. She gave him advice on how to dress, which restaurants to choose, even how to phrase his thoughts more precisely in a job interview. It seemed like caring at the time, but it was never advice. Those were the instructions. They were performed, or discussed why they should be performed. If he objected, Grace patiently explained why his version was worse, or laughed, as she did today, as if his words didn't deserve a serious answer. It went on like that for all of 5 years. He remembered how she had talked him out of going to her parents' house for Christmas. She'd assured him it was a waste of time and the holidays were better spent together. Then there were friends. She called them childish and said he'd grown up, and they hadn't. Then a job. She convinced him that a position at her company would give him better prospects. Gradually his life ceased to be his. Later that night, lying in bed, Henry suddenly thought, what if I left? The thought was so unexpected that he even sat up, staring into the darkness. Leave? He'd never seriously considered the option. Yes, there were grievances, but who doesn't face them in a marriage? But for the first time in years, he imagined, what if he wasn't here tomorrow? That idea didn't let him go until the morning. The next day he made an appointment with a psychologist. The office was quiet. Only the bare branches swaying in the autumn wind crackled outside the window. Henry sat in a deep armchair opposite a man in glasses, who waited silently for him to speak. There was a bowl of water on the table, but Henry didn't even reach for it. He already felt his throat dry, but he realized that it wasn't about thirst. To be honest, I don't even know where to start, he said at last, struggling to find the words. Start with what brought you here, the therapist replied calmly, nodding his head slightly. Henry ran his palm over his face, as if hoping to shake off the confusion. The cursed phrase, if you had been more obedient, was still running through his mind. He couldn't forget Grace's tone or the look on her face. I've been married 5 years, he said, interlocking his fingers. I always thought we had a normal marriage. Yes, Grace is stronger, more determined, sometimes pressured, but I thought it was just a character trait. I didn't pay attention to the little things, didn't want to stir up conflicts. But recently, I suddenly realized. Henry fell silent. There were so many thoughts in his head that it was hard to get one thing out. He couldn't say at what moment it happened. I don't decide anything. Absolutely everything in my life is controlled by my wife. The psychologist showed neither surprise nor disapproval. He only nodded slightly, showing that he was listening. At first I even liked that she was so confident. She suggested the best restaurants, told me how to dress, advised me how to behave in the company of her friends. I saw it as caring. Henry fell silent again, remembering. Then she started criticizing my decisions. It seemed that her advice became mandatory. If I did something different, she would just sit down and explain why I was wrong. Or she'd laugh like a silly child. You say you perceived it as caring. When did you realize it wasn't? Henry pressed his lips together. When had he realized it? When did he stop justifying her words and actions? The other day, Grace said that if I were more obedient, we'd both have an easier life. And that suddenly struck a chord with me. I thought for the first time, why should I be obedient? Am I a child? Aren't we partners? The psychologist tilted his head slightly, scrutinizing his face. You felt that you were not perceived as an equal. Exactly. Henry exhaled, feeling understood for the first time in a long time. This is the first big moment. Before, you were comfortable thinking that she was just taking care of you. But now you've seen another layer. There's no partnership. There's control. Henry clenched his palms, feeling an unpleasant feeling growing inside. You said you don't decide anything on your own anymore. The therapist continued. Let's try to figure it out. In what areas of your life is this particularly noticeable? Henry thought about it, remembering how many times a day he asked permission or waited for his wife's approval. Everywhere, he admitted quietly. I don't choose where we eat dinner. I don't buy clothes without her approval. I've even stopped seeing my friends because she doesn't think they're mature enough. That is, your social connections are also monitored. Henry nodded, but it was hard to speak further. Your finances. This question proved to be particularly frustrating. We have a joint account. Grace keeps a budget. She says she's better with money. I don't even know exactly how much I have left to save. The therapist made a note in his notebook. What about your career? That question caught Henry off guard. She persuaded me to leave my previous company because, according to her, there were no prospects there. I had my doubts, but she convinced me to move to another company. Now I work in her company, under the guidance of her friends. The therapist nodded slowly. So key areas of your life, finances, career, social connections, household decisions, depend heavily on her approval? Henry swallowed, realizing he'd heard it out loud for the first time. Yeah. Chuckles. The therapist set aside his notebook, looked at him carefully, and, after a little hesitation, said, Henry, I have to tell you straight. It's not just your wife's authoritarian nature. You're in an emotionally controlling relationship. Henry didn't immediately understand the meaning of those words. They hung in the air, penetrating inside, turning something in his mind. Emotionally controlling relationships. He never thought of it that way. Never called it control. People often don't notice it for years. The therapist continued. You get used to it. You explain that it's just caring, that your partner wants what's best for you. But in fact, it's not an equal relationship. It's control. Henry exhaled slowly, feeling a chill run down his back. What am I supposed to do? The therapist looked at him carefully. First, you have to realize, and honestly answer yourself the question. Do you want to live like this? Henry thought about the therapist's words for a long time, as if trying them on himself, but understanding was difficult. Everything he'd heard didn't fit into the familiar picture of his marriage, even though he felt the words had weight. An emotionally controlling relationship. The phrase wouldn't get out of his head. Was his family, his wife. His life not a union of two loving people, but something else entirely. On the way home, he tried to remember the last time he'd made a decision on his own, without regard for Grace's opinion. When he'd chosen what to wear without her comments. When he'd spent money without her supervision. When he'd gone out with friends without explaining himself to her, as if to a strict parent. Thinking back on it all, he realized for the first time how deeply entrenched in subordination he was. Henry couldn't sleep that night, turning from side to side, listening to his wife's steady breathing beside him. He knew that he could no longer ignore what he had learned. He needed to speak, to try to explain to Grace how he felt. Perhaps she just didn't realize what it looked like from the outside. Perhaps no one had told her that her behavior wasn't the norm, but a control. The next morning, at breakfast, he gathered his thoughts and spoke. Grace, I need to talk to you. His wife didn't immediately look away from the screen of the phone, on which she was scrolling through her social media feed. She barely glanced at it as she continued to scroll through the news. I'm listening, she replied absent-mindedly, clearly not paying attention to his tone. Henry set the cup on the table, trying to remain calm. I feel like there is an imbalance in our relationship. Sometimes I feel like I don't make decisions on my own, but just follow your instructions. Grace froze for a second and then smiled, shaking her head. Are you serious? Henry, where is this stupidity coming from anyway? Her light laughter hit him harder than her shout or her anger. He felt his insides tighten at the condescending tone. I mean it. It's important that you hear me. Grace put the phone away and looked at him, now with slight irritation. Hear what? That I only make you do what I want you to do. Do you realize that right now? Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. She rolled her eyes and leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest. Henry, you're a grown man. No one's forcing you to do anything. You can always do things your own way if you want to, but you always find a way to explain to me why I'm wrong, he replied, looking into her eyes. A shadow of irritation flashed across her face, but it disappeared immediately, replaced by a cold chuckle. So, it's called common sense. If I see you making a mistake, am I supposed to keep quiet? Watch you ruin your life? But why are my decisions necessarily mistakes? Grace stared at him intently, then slowly put her elbows on the table and interlaced her fingers. Okay, she said in the tone of a teacher explaining something to a confused student. Let's break it down. Who always forgot to pay the bills on time until I took over? Who picked restaurants we didn't like until I started doing it myself? Who couldn't do your tax return correctly until I did it for you? Every word sounded like an accusation, and Henry could feel it. Now tell me, Henry, she continued, tilting her head to the side. Am I wrong? Didn't you feel better when I took over some of the decisions? Henry understood where she was going with this. She would present it as care, as help, as love. But he already knew it wasn't care. It was power disguised as good intentions. The question is not whether I'm better or worse off. The issue is that I don't have the right to choose. Grace grinned again. Choice. You want the right to make mistakes? Okay, go ahead. Do something without my advice, Henry. See what happens. There was a sneer in her voice, a hidden challenge, as if she knew for sure he couldn't handle it. So you're pretty sure I'm going to fail? Oh, don't start that psychological stuff, she sighed tiredly. Where did you even get that? You've never said that before. She looked at him carefully, and suddenly her eyes squinted slightly. Wait, were you talking to someone? She felt the change, noticed it in his words, in his intonation, in the new confidence he had lacked before. It doesn't matter, he replied, trying to avoid a direct answer. But Grace had already realized. Henry, have you seen a therapist? Grace nodded slowly, then leaned back and picked up her phone again. Well, I hear you, she said, pretending to text someone. Henry felt that something had changed after their conversation, although outwardly everything remained the same. Grace didn't throw tantrums, didn't make scandals, or even sarcastic remarks, but there was tension in the air, which was hard to ignore. She didn't bother to find out what exactly he was discussing with the psychologist, but her gaze was different now, studying, evaluating, as if she was trying to calculate his next move. The first alarm bell was her sudden desire to have dinner with his mother. I was thinking, Grace said at breakfast, carelessly stirring sugar in her tea. It's been a long time since we've seen your mother. We should invite her to dinner, don't you think? Henry raised his eyes from the phone, glancing at his wife in surprise. She had never shown much desire to spend time with his family, considering such meetings a waste of time. You always said we have too few days off to spend on family dinners, he said carefully, trying to understand her motives. Grace smiled slightly, pretending not to notice his suspicions. Yeah, but I thought your mom might miss us. She's the only one you've got. I want to show her that we're okay. That phrase made Henry tense up. Show who? And why? 2 days later, they had dinner at a restaurant with his mother, who looked clearly pleased with her daughter-in-law's sudden initiative. Grace held herself perfectly. She smiled, inquired about his affairs, complimented him, even called Henry my favorite. But then the most interesting thing began. Mom, Henry has been so weird lately, Grace said suddenly, shaking her head with a slight laugh. He says I'm controlling him too much. Can you believe it? His mother looked at him puzzled, then smiled. Henry, don't be ridiculous. Grace just cares about you. She's a woman. She's supposed to. Exactly. Grace picked up on it, covering his hand with hers with a satisfied smile. A man should listen to his wife, because she takes care of him. Isn't it bad when someone helps you make the right decisions? She knows he started to doubt, and now she wants to drive him back into his familiar frame of reference. Through his mother. Through guilt. Through societal conditioning. I just think equality is important in a relationship, Henry replied calmly, removing his hand. Grace instantly noticed the gesture, but only grinned without losing her composure. Of course, sweetie. We're equals. It's just that someone has to care a little more, because not everyone can make the right choices. His mother nodded in agreement, not even noticing the implication. Yes, women are naturally wiser. Henry, don't take this as pressure. You're just lucky to have a caring wife. After dinner, as they drove home, he was silent, going over the conversation in his head. Are you angry? Grace asked suddenly, looking at him sideways. I didn't expect you to discuss our relationship with my mother, he replied in an even voice. Grace shrugged, not taking her eyes off the road. Well, why not? I think she understands you even better than you do. You've decided to use her to regain control of me? Henry, you're overreacting. I just wanted you to get an outside opinion. You mean an opinion that agrees with yours? Well, if it matches, maybe there's some truth to it. He turned away to the window, realizing that this conversation was pointless. She won't come clean. She won't say outright, yes, I'm manipulating you. But he had seen her methods before. The next day the situation was repeated, but from the other side. Hi, Henry. Jessica, his colleague, exclaimed joyfully when he arrived at the office. Grace wrote to me yesterday, saying that you're having a crisis in your relationship. He froze for a second, not immediately realizing the meaning of what was being said. She's what? Well, yes. She wrote to me on social networks, saying that you were going through some strange period. Suddenly started to think about who was in charge in the family. She asked me to talk to you, to support you. Henry inhaled slowly, suppressing his irritation. It's obvious now. Grace wasn't just trying to convince him that she was right. She creates an information bubble around him, where everyone around him repeats the same phrases. Grace just cares. A wife should guide her husband. You're overcomplicating things. He came home earlier than usual, walked silently to the bedroom, pulled out his suitcase and set it on the bed. He couldn't take it anymore. Henry realized that after the conversation with Grace and her attempts to manipulate him through his environment, he couldn't stay in this marriage any longer. The realization that she was using friends and family to break his resistance only made him more determined to leave. He had already made his final decision and begun preparations to leave, but now he had to proceed with caution. The first step was to open a separate bank account, which Grace didn't know about. He realized that he could not take too much money at once, otherwise it would arouse suspicion. So he started with small transfers, giving the appearance of normal purchases or cash withdrawals. Every time Grace looked at the statements from their joint account, he pretended to spend the money on lunches at cafes or fuel for the car. The next step was to find an apartment where he could move to immediately after leaving. He didn't want to live with friends or relatives, because he realized that that was where Grace would look for him. She would try to press through them, to make him come back, as she had done before with his mother. So he decided to rent a place through an acquaintance, formalizing the contract so that his name would not appear in the documents. Every evening when he returned home, he carefully thought about what things he would be able to take away unnoticed. He couldn't just take the suitcase and carry it out of the house. Grace would immediately realize that something was going on. So he began to gradually take away the important things, documents, a laptop, a couple of changes of clothes. He planned to leave everything else behind, because freedom was more important than possessions. But despite her caution, Grace still noticed the change. Henry, you seem distracted lately, she said in the evening, watching him over a cup of tea. Thinking about something? He had prepared himself in advance for such questions, so he just shrugged. A lot of work, he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Grace didn't look away as she continued to study his face. Work? I thought you were just distant. Henry picked up his coffee cup and took a sip to hide the tension. Just tired. Fall is always a tough time. Are you sure that's all it is? What else is there? He asked calmly, looking her straight in the eye. I don't know, but if there is something, you'll tell me, right? Sure. She didn't say another word, but he knew he would be watched now. The next day he noticed that Grace started checking his phone. In the morning, he saw that the gadget was in a different place, although he remembered exactly where he had left it overnight. He did not start a scandal, because he realized that if Grace felt threatened, she would become more active. So he changed tactics. Now, when he came home from work, he did not go straight home, but to a rented apartment, where he left the things he had packed. He made copies of all the documents, so that if Grace tried to blackmail him, he would have important papers on hand. After a week, she moved on to direct questions. Henry, are you avoiding me? He set the laptop aside and looked at her, trying to remain calm. What makes you say that? You've become detached. You don't ask questions. You don't argue. You don't consult. It's like you're just waiting for something. I'm just tired of arguing all the time. You're the one who said I was too stubborn. So I figured it'd be easier to keep my mouth shut. So everything's okay then? Sure. You know, let's take a little vacation. Go to the country house. Just the two of us. No work, no phones. Just reboot. Henry instantly realized it was a trap. She wants to isolate him, remove him from his familiar environment, cut off his escape routes. Good idea, but I can't take a vacation now, he said, trying to make his voice sound natural. At least for the weekend, then. 2 days of silence, nature, good wine. She leaned toward him, placing her hands on his shoulders. We need this, love. I want us to be together again. Before, those words might have shaken his resolve, but now he saw their point. This isn't an attempt to repair the relationship. This is an attempt to regain control. Let's discuss this later, he said softly, and took her hands away. She's got it all figured out. Disappointment flashed in her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by cold detachment. Sure, whatever you say. Henry felt that Grace's patience was running out. She felt that something was happening, but she couldn't understand what it was. Her gaze became more intense, her movements more tense, and her questions more insistent. She waited for the moment when he would crack, when he would say something unnecessary, when he would confess. Friday night, returning from work, he found her in the kitchen with a glass of wine. Grace greeted him with a gentle smile. I made dinner, she said, waving her hand at the table. It's been a long time since we've spent time together, hasn't it? Henry looked at the table where there were candles, dishes he really loved, and a bottle of expensive wine. Everything looked perfect, but the feeling of anxiety didn't disappear. Thanks, but I'm not hungry. Of course you're not hungry, she grinned, taking a sip of wine. You haven't been responding to anything lately. Is something going on, Henry? No. Grace slowly stood up, stepped closer, and ran her fingers along the collar of his shirt. You know, you're different. It's like you're preparing for something. He didn't answer, but only took her hand off his shoulder. That's what pisses me off. She suddenly exploded, stepping back. You ignore me. You avoid talking to me. You don't argue. You don't react. She clenched her fists, breathing heavily as if she were holding back anger. I'm not stupid, Henry. You think I don't know what's going on? Henry knew she was trying to get him emotional. She wants him to start making excuses, defending himself, proving that nothing is going on. What's going on, Grace? He asked calmly, looking into her eyes. She laughed, but her laugh was strained. You tell me what's going on. Why are you drifting away? Why aren't you mine anymore? I was never yours, he said in an even voice. Grace froze. A look of genuine surprise flashed across her face, as if she had heard something incredible. What did you just say? I said I was never yours. I was me, but you couldn't see that. So you're going to leave after all? Henry didn't answer immediately. He knew that any word spoken at that moment would be used against him. You're not even answering me, she shouted, slamming her palm on the table. Admit it, Henry. Do you want to leave? He took a deep breath, realizing this was the moment of truth. Yeah. Chuckles. Grace opened her mouth, but couldn't find the words right away. She looked at him, and he could see the emotions struggling in her eyes. Anger, fear, confusion, all mixed up in a chaos of feelings. You have no right, she whispered, and her voice trembled. I have a right to myself, Grace, Henry answered firmly. You don't know what you're doing, she said, shaking her head. You're ruining everything. For what? For some stupid idea of independence? For your own sake. Grace grabbed the wine glass and smashed it against the wall with all her might. You're not leaving, she shouted, her eyes glittering with anger. Henry watched in silence as red drops of wine dripped down the white wall. I've already left, Grace, he said, turning to leave. But as he approached the door, her voice sounded cold and dangerous. You're going to regret this. We'll see. Henry left the apartment. His emotions were still bubbling inside him, but one thing prevailed: relief. He had done what he had thought about for so long, but couldn't dare to do. Now a completely different life opened before him, where Grace was not there, her control, her orders, and her power. But he did not yet know that a new blow was ahead of him that would overturn his ideas about the past. The next morning, when he checked his phone, among the dozens of missed calls from Grace, he saw a strange message from their mutual acquaintance. Brother, do you even know what she's done? Henry frowned and opened the chat room and saw a link to some closed social media profile. He clicked on the link and saw a picture he couldn't immediately realize. Grace. Spreading hair, half-naked body, open lips, and next to it, someone else. Henry squinted at the man lying next to her. Young, fit. He recognized him at once. It was their neighbor, the guy from the top floor, whom Grace had repeatedly called the cheeky boy. She always made disparaging jokes about him, saying that he was overconfident, that his manners annoyed her. But now this guy was in her bed. Henry looked at the picture and felt hollow disgust and disappointment. A second later, another message came through. She did it the same night you left. Henry closed the phone silently, leaned back in his chair, and looked out the window. So that's it then? So her reaction to the loss of control was not to try to comprehend, not to want to figure things out, but to cheat with the first guy she saw. Grace didn't know how to lose, didn't know how to admit her weakness. Her sense of power over people had always saved her, and when she lost it, she had to urgently look for a new source of control, and she found him in the body of a young neighbor. Henry suddenly realized that she was worse off than he was. She was screaming about freedom, about enjoying life, but her actions were cheap and pathetic. It wasn't passion, not love, not revenge, it was panic. A few hours later, Grace called. Henry stared at the screen for a long moment before pressing, accept call. So you saw, she said without saying hello. There was no remorse in her voice, only stubbornness and defiance. Yes, he answered calmly. Grace fell silent, as if waiting for a different reaction. Aren't you going to say anything? She asked with irritation. What am I supposed to say? Like asking why I did it. Henry grinned, shaking his head. You did it because you don't know how to lose. You think I lost. Grace, I'm not playing anymore. She exhaled loudly, but her voice still shook with tension. You have no idea how much you're going to regret this. We'll see. He dropped the call and felt it was the end. A year had passed. Henry was sitting in a cozy coffee shop, slowly turning the pages of a book, but his thoughts were hovering somewhere far away. He thought about how much things had changed since he left that life. It seemed to him then that there would be a long and painful road to freedom ahead, that he would never be able to get rid of the past completely. Yes, it was difficult at first. He felt torn apart, didn't know how to live without constant control, without someone to decide everything for him. For the first few months, he caught himself waiting for someone's approval, trying to coordinate his decisions. But one day he woke up and realized he wasn't afraid anymore. He no longer checks his phone, waiting for angry messages. No longer thinks about what Grace will say. No longer explains every action he takes. The phone rang, and Henry looked away from the book. The name of an acquaintance he hadn't spoken to for a long time popped up on the screen. You won't believe who I just saw. Buddy's voice sounded excited. Who? Grace. And, bro, hell, it's just heaven and earth. Henry remained silent, allowing his friend to continue. I ran into her at the drugstore by chance. She had lost weight, looked like she'd been sick for years. Her eyes were faded. Her clothes were cheap. Her hair was dirty. Henry felt no gloating, no pleasure, not even sympathy. They say she's in trouble. Like what? She got sick with something venereal. I heard it caused her to develop some kind of chronic inflammation. Henry wasn't surprised. He remembered the picture he'd seen a year ago. He remembered the neighbor Grace had brought into their bed the same day he'd left. Her panicked attempt to prove to herself that she hadn't lost control had turned out to have the worst consequences. Did she say something to you? Yeah. She asked me how you were doing. I told her you were happy. You know what she said? What? He's always been weak. Would have broken anyway. Grace has never been good at admitting mistakes. She broke herself, bro. Henry finished his coffee, feeling no emotion whatsoever. She made a choice, and he made his own. Take care of yourself, brother, Henry said, and dropped the call. He picked up the book again, but now his thoughts no longer distracted him. What do you think of the ending of the story? Do you think that Grace deserved her fate, or is it too cruel a punishment? What moment of the story seemed to you the strongest and most emotional? Write in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you like the story, please give this video a thumbs up and leave a comment below. Your support helps the algorithm show my content more often. If you are new to the channel, do not forget to hit that subscribe button. It really helps me keep making more stories for you.